Hello, and welcome back to Worm from Home. This is the second of two episodes looking at air pollution and how it has affected East London. In Air Part 1, we talked about smog and traced the history of London's air pollution from the dawn of the Industrial Revolution up until the Clean Air Act of 1956 and its immediate aftermath. It is in many ways a story of success, which feels like something of a rarity among environmental narratives. The Great Smog of 1952 forced a long worsening chronic problem to a crisis point, and real, widespread change was eventually made by government. Rates of urban pollution, and the respiratory diseases associated with it, fell precipitously. But we also learned that this change was unevenly distributed, and that industrial geography and related corporate interests caused coal smoke pollution to cling on longer in some areas than others. If you missed that episode, you can go back and listen to it now. The scope and frequency of environmental legislation continued to increase throughout the 20th century. The Clean Air Act itself was expanded in 1968, with further restrictions on dark smoke emissions and the provision of new smoke control areas. Both the Clean Air Acts were eventually repealed and consolidated by a final 1993 Clean Air Act. Further pollution regulation was introduced by successive waves of general environmental legislation, of which air pollution restrictions have formed a part. These include the 1974 Control of Pollution Act, the Environmental Protection Act of 1990, and the Environment Act of 1995, as well as a number of European Union directives governing air quality that have been incorporated into British law. This legislation has dealt with industrial emissions, residential smoke sources, manufacturing, and increasingly with one of the major sources of urban pollution in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the private motor car. Car exhaust fumes are not smoke, but because cars burn fuel in internal combustion engines, contain many of the same types of pollutants, including sulfur dioxide and particulate matter. Cars also generate additional particulate matter in the form of microplastics, from tyres shedding as they meet the road surface. Cars also release harmful carbon monoxide and nitrogen dioxide into the atmosphere. Exhaust fumes are in some ways a more insidious form of pollution than smoke was. Even before cleaner petrol and restrictions on diesel, although car fumes can smell bad, cars do not constantly belch visible smoke into the immediate atmosphere the way a smokestack or household chimney did. Much car pollution is essentially invisible, only becoming more apparent if it too forms smogs under certain atmospheric conditions. The effects of car pollution are also often hidden compared to smoke. Exposure to air pollution in London is thought to contribute to up to 4,000 premature deaths a year. However, it is difficult to judge compared to earlier smog events, where excess deaths could be closely correlated with specific periods of extreme pollution, and those deaths were more likely to be from acute pollution-triggered illnesses. Present-day air pollution is more likely to become a contributing factor in shortened lifespans, linked in ongoing research to certain cancers, cardiovascular disease, and other illnesses with complex long-term causation patterns. London's air is much cleaner than it used to be, so levels of acute respiratory disease triggered by air pollution is proportionally much lower. However, polluted air is having a real and detrimental effect on people's health over time, and in a way that is often much less obvious, requiring more complex epidemiological understanding to bring to light. Moreover, while much rarer than in the past, acute and sometimes fatal illness brought on directly by air pollution exposure still exists. In 2013, Ella Kissy Deborah died of an asthma attack. She was 9 years old, and in the years preceding her death had had over 30 emergency hospital admissions related to her asthma. Investigations after her death found that nitrogen dioxide levels where she lived near the South Circular Road in Lewisham, South London, exceeded both national and EU permitted levels during her short life. In 2020, an inquest found that air pollution was a direct contributing cause of her death. She became the first person in the world to have air pollution listed on her death certificate. Despite the huge changes made by the Clean Air Act almost 70 years ago, air quality in London remains a real problem, in the acute sense and especially in terms of chronic, long-term exposure, causing health problems over decades. And, like the industrial and domestic emissions of historical smog pollution, its presence is also unevenly distributed throughout the city, systematically correlating with house prices in residential areas. The more expensive your home, the more likely you are to live in an area of cleaner air. In areas like East London, where richer and poorer neighbourhoods are stacked very close together, these differences can in places be detected almost street to street. Tower Hamlets, for example, has significant amounts of green space with relatively clean air, while the borough also contains 4 of the most polluted roads, not just in the city, but in the entire UK. In Limehouse, current monitoring indicates an air pollution density 3 times as high as London as a whole. This is partly due to a lack of green space here that, as with smoke pollution, is crucial to allowing airborne pollutants to dissipate quickly. But Limehouse's atmosphere also suffers significantly from the Limehouse Link Tunnel under the Limehouse Basin and the Rotherhite Tunnel under the Thames. East London has several such car tunnels, like the Blackwall Tunnel and the Silvertown Tunnel that opened this year. Within London, there are no bridges across the Thames east of Tower Bridge, a reflection of centuries of class and industrial geography around which areas required easy access by ship and so couldn't be blocked by bridges, and which populations were therefore afforded easy access across the river. As the city has grown, tunnels have been constructed to allow car traffic to cross the river east of Tower Bridge. In tunnels, air pollutants build up very quickly, causing high pollution concentrations in the areas at the mouth of the tunnels and the routing of large numbers of vehicles through the same neighbourhoods in order to access them. It feels strange, looking from the present day, that the great smog that choked London in December 1952 was not caused by car pollution. Cars are now so ubiquitous, such an ordinary part of the urban fabric, that I, born in the 1980s, struggle to even visualise the city without them. But in the early 1950s, private cars were still largely the preserve of the fairly wealthy. There were cars on the road at that time, of course, including personal vehicles, and more often in the form of taxis and other trade vehicles, some with petrol engines, like delivery vans and lorries, as well as diesel-powered buses. But the London of 1952 was not a car city. Travel by car was far from a common form of day-to-day transport for the vast majority of people, and car exhaust fumes figured marginally in the grand scheme of urban pollutants. By the end of the century, of course, all of this would have changed. Coincidental with the Clean Air Act coming into effect in the mid-1950s, Britain was on the brink of a sweeping change in transportation habits. Over the next 2 decades, a revolutionary overhaul was made in how people travelled, both within cities and outside of them, a change that has had wide-reaching economic, social, and of course environmental effects. Between 1950 and 1965, the number of cars on British roads increased from 4.4 million to 13 million. In the next 5 years, up till 1970, another 2 million had been added to the roads. It was the largest boom in motoring expansion in the country's history. To understand how Britain became a motor country, and London a car city, we need to consider both individual behaviour and the high-level decision-making that encourages, or forces, people to make different transportation choices. From the mid-1950s, cars started to become more affordable. Not necessarily because production and retail costs were dropping very quickly, but because on average, people had more money. People in Britain's post-war era experienced a marked shift in class formation and living conditions, often for the better. This new relative affluence was often in the form of disposable income, and a burgeoning mass motoring industry was ready to take people's cash. By 1958, and only 2 years after the passing of the Clean Air Act, British car manufacturers alone were producing more than 1 million new cars a year, a significant proportion of which were for the domestic market. The boom in car production was of course accompanied by a significant increase in road building. People do not drive cars anywhere and everywhere. You need roads to drive on. During this early era of mass motoring, over 1,000 miles of motorway were built in Britain in just 15 years. Cars then need roads, and roads need cars, and they feed each other. Where increased road capacity encourages driving, and increased driving pushes for more road capacity, an upward or downward spiral of capacity and need, depending on your point of view. But this is not simply an organic relationship of supply and demand. Car manufacturing companies do not build roads, governments do, at a local or national level. The installation of a nationwide car infrastructure of the type that now exists in Britain and in London required state investment, both political and financial, to a significant degree. Contemporary policymakers were of course keenly aware of this. By the mid-1960s, British politicians of all parties were very clear about the reality of the car revolution. Some thought this was a good thing, others a bad thing, but all were agreed that a fundamental change in transportation was happening and required some government response. In this view, what matters is how the state responds to some phenomenon that is already occurring. Should the use of private cars for transportation be encouraged or discouraged? How, if at all, should the state respond to the perceived downsides of mass motoring? What decisions should be made for future urban planning? And so on. But some analyses of the relationship between the car and the state go further, arguing that states do not only participate in the development of motoring, but are active and crucial drivers of it. Matthew Patterson, for example, argues that during the early and mid-20th century, many Western states deliberately pursued the expansion of car use, not just as transport policy, but as industrial policy. Several facets of the car, from its production to its ability to move workers around, make it a phenomenally powerful stimulus for a certain type of economic growth that enriches both the corporation and the state. Cars make for more mobile workers and allow people to work further from their homes. In the 1970s, for example, people in Britain travelled on average about an hour a day and covered 4,500 miles a year. By the mid-1990s, they still travelled an average of an hour a day, but were now covering 7,000 miles a year. These increased travel speeds make labour more mobile from an employer point of view, allowing recruitment from a broader pool of people with less investment in new workplaces. Car production essentially invents the modern industrial production line too, or at the very least popularises it, in the form of Fordism, in which workers undertake a smaller number of more specialised roles on the factory floor, each contributing to only a specific part of an item's production process. Production organised this way will, within typical capitalist relations between workers and owners, generate an enormous amount of profit to then be centralised back into the corporation. Alongside these economic incentives, car and road expansion was, in the 20th century, often associated with military preparedness. At a national level, to have an extensive road network and be engaged in the production of vehicles was an indication of military readiness. The significant portion of war's environmental impact that comprises industrialised transportation is something we've already encountered in episode 2 of War in the Woods. So for reasons of national security and economic growth, many countries, including Britain, began investing heavily in both car production and installing car infrastructure. In Britain, the government spent £55 million on road building in 1957, a figure that rose to £330 million by 1970. And the state didn't just build roads, but contributed directly to individual car ownership through considerable subsidies to hire purchase schemes and other consumer initiatives. State investment in car usage in turn grew the economic power of the car manufacturing companies, a power to which successive governments would then more or less willingly capitulate. Those 1,000 miles of motorway built in Britain in 15 years were constructed as part of a road building scheme, the specifics of which had been proposed by British car makers lobbying in the 1930s, a proposal that was then adopted almost in its entirety as policy a decade later. This matters partly because I think we're often inclined to conceive of buses, trains, trams and tubes as a question of transport policy, but of cars almost as a force of nature. But of course they are not. And the question of how millions and millions of people travel every day to work, family, leisure and commerce is of course one very much of state policy, even when the implementation of that policy is in part expressed in millions of individual vehicle purchases. It is governments, under more or less successful pressure from industrial motoring lobbies, that decide whether we should drive as a matter of routine transportation. And because transport unavoidably takes place in public, you can't travel somewhere within the confines of your own home. To pursue a car-based transportation policy is of course to make huge changes in the lives even of people who do not drive. Although roads have of course existed for thousands of years, the type and extent of road building required for widespread car use has a profound effect on the landscape and the cityscape. All forms of transportation of course require some change in the built environment. Trains need tracks, trams need stops, and so on. But because the car as transport has to go everywhere, the potential scope of road building becomes incredibly broad. Through the 1980s and 1990s, opposition to this expansion in the form of anti-road protests sprang up across the UK, including in East London. The M11 link road to connect traffic arteries in Hackney and Leyton threatened the demolition of 400 homes in Leyton, Leytonstone and Wanstead. In 1976, a local action group was formed to fight this proposed extension. Activists petitioned, raised awareness, and pushed for public inquiries for over a decade, and when construction eventually began on the road in the early 90s, it became a national environmental cause. As the Department for Transport gradually forced evictions from homes slated for demolition, activists started squatting them. This squatting action culminated in the creation of what was called a Festival of Resistance along Claremont Road, a street that ended up populated almost exclusively by environmental activists and residents who refused to leave to allow the road to be built. In the end, the campaign lost, and the M11 link was built, but not before delaying the project significantly and at substantial additional cost. The subsequent Labour government, elected in 1997, made significant reductions to road building policy, which has often been attributed to the fierce anti-road campaigning of the 80s and 90s, including that in Leighton. The private motor car constituted such a break with previous forms of mobility, and within mere decades became such a fully normalised part of the urban and suburban life, that sociologists like John Ury have argued that their use has created a whole automobility system, or car system. This system reaches far beyond the car itself, or even the roads we drive on, and has reshaped not just transport, but work, social life, the environment, production, and even the ways we conceive of space, distance, and time. The car system manifests in certain concrete ways as material changes in the built environment. This includes not just roads, but car parks, petrol stations, and provision for on-street parking. There are secondary material effects too. Widespread car use makes the out-of-town shopping centre possible, makes the suburbs a place you can live while still participating in the life of the city, and changes what types of holiday and leisure activities it is possible and profitable to invest in. And these physical changes, of course, then impact how we organise our lives, when and where we shop for food, how we spend our free time, what type of work we do and where, who we can form relationships with, and how far we are likely to live from family and friends. Playing such a fundamental role as they do in how our societies and personal lives are now organised, cars also alter how we conceive of distance, time, and the spaces through which we move. The car makes it not just more likely, but possible at all, for people to travel in certain ways. David Begg has noted that most car journeys were not made by public transport before the car was invented. The car did not replace other transportation modes on the same routes, but rewrote and hugely extended what those routes could and would be. Cars let us travel further, more quickly, and on our own schedule, and this in turn begins to create a requirement to be able to travel further and more quickly, and at any hour of the day. It is not just cars and roads that feed one another's expansion, but the organisation and reorganisation of society around car use itself. Ury terms this dynamic the coercive flexibility by which the car system replicates itself, making itself more necessary or even obligatory to participate in the more flexibility it offers. These observations remind me a lot of the changes in space and time made by ubiquitous mobile phone uptake within my own lifetime. Just as the phone makes us always contactable and so obliged to be always available, so too the car makes us always mobile and so obliged to always be on the move. It's interesting that where scholars of car culture tend to emphasise the ways mass motoring split work from home by creating longer commutes, phones have now brought work back into our homes and personal and intimate lives once again. While the car has had a significant impact on travel between cities, it is in the city itself that its effects are most obvious. City streets have always been at times crowded places, with people on foot, markets, animals, carts of goods, and later carriages, taxis, trams, and delivery vehicles. But cars constitute a change in urban traffic of both category and degree. By orientating the car as a vehicle that can undertake any type of urban journey, whether for work, pleasure, or otherwise, and investing heavily in infrastructure to make travel by car the most feasible option, there are more cars on the urban road than there ever were any type of non-car vehicles. And there are only cars on the road. Mopeds and bicycles are more or less poorly tolerated guests. In many places, London included, it is well understood by city planning that for cycling and bus networks to function, it is necessary to create dedicated lanes for these forms of travel. The road is for the car. Whether you drive or not, you live in a car city. Whether you like it or not, driving is often the best or only feasible way for you to get around. Having invested heavily in installing a British car system, the government in effect gave itself a new pollution problem, hot on the heels of the relative victory of the Clean Air Act. Exactly what problems this new form of transportation was causing environmentally was revealed as the type of air pollution monitoring being done across the country continued to expand. In the introduction to this episode, I was able to cite pollution levels on a neighbourhood basis, even down to which streets are the most polluted in a certain area. The ability to do this reflects a significant degree of development in the technologies and organisational approaches used in monitoring air quality. By the time of the 1956 Act, the monitoring available to track air pollutants had developed enormously in a relatively short period. This development was partly technological, allowing for more granular information to be collected on specific pollutants, but also organisational, involving the growth and refinement of new networks of collaborative data collection across the country. In the 19th century, atmospheric pollutant research was largely in its infancy in Britain. While some work had been done to begin to scientifically assess levels of smoke particulates and other pollutants, including the research and campaigning that led to the Alkali Acts, those working toward pollution reduction still relied largely on the visibility of smoke pouring from industrial chimneys and the smogs that periodically enveloped towns and cities. As the 20th century progressed, however, new technologies and innovative measuring strategies allowed for progressively more precise and instructive measurement of different specific pollutants. The standard deposit gauge was developed from some of the earliest forms of pollution measurement. Very similar to a rain gauge that measures precipitation, the deposit gauge is a large-lipped container that collects all liquid and solid matter that falls into it. Like a precipitation gauge, it too collects water in the form of rain, snow, and so on, but its contents are also analysed for both soluble and insoluble pollutant matter, including tar, soot, sulfates, and ammonia. At around the same time, smoke levels could also be analysed increasingly closely by the automatic and daily smoke filters. This filtration wasn't to remove smoke from the air to reduce pollution levels, but rather used filters to capture an impression of the smoke levels in a particular period. These apparatuses pull air through a permeable white paper disc over the course of an hour or a day. The smoke particulates in the air leave a circular impression on this disc, the darkness and density of which can then be used to calculate the weight of solid particulate matter in a given volume of the atmosphere in that place and during that period. The first half of the 20th century also saw progress in the measurement of less visible pollutants. The impressively named volumetric sulfur dioxide apparatus was invented in 1931 and passed a predetermined volume of air not through paper but a diluted hydrogen peroxide solution. After a period of 24 hours, this liquid was then titrated to find out how much sulfur it retained during that time from the sulfur dioxide in the air that had passed through it. The early 30s also saw the introduction of my personal favourite, the lead peroxide candle. Lead peroxide is a compound that will form lead sulfate on contact with sulfur dioxide. Candles of lead peroxide were made by wrapping fabric coated in lead sulfate paste around porcelain cylinders. This rough candle shape was then placed in an open, sheltering case where it sat in contact with the air for a month, after which the sulfur compounds that had formed on its surface were weighed, with this weight used as an indication of how much sulfur dioxide had been present in the immediate atmosphere during that time. These new devices were ingenious, clever ways to make the often invisible visible and to measure things that definitionally are ambient and transitory, but now in concrete ways. By the time the Beaver Commission met after the 1952 Great Smog, a great deal of data was already available that previous waves of smoke abatement attempts had not had access to. However, it was not only the development of the scientific measuring tools themselves that massively broadened the scope of this monitoring. As environmental historian Stephen Moseley has observed, the way in which this monitoring was organised was also crucial. Measurements of some value or other are not necessarily data, and data does not automatically mean useful information. To be useful in answering some question, data has to be able to be contextualised, to be collected and then interpreted within a framework that gives it meaning. The beginning of a real pollution monitoring network in Britain came out of the smoke abatement movement that we discussed in Air Part 1. Early campaigners for cleaner air recognised that more detailed scientific backing for their cause would be crucial to legitimacy with both the public and government. While smoke endangered the health of millions of people, there was still a fairly widespread attitude in politics that dedicated smoke abatement activism was faddish and cranky, an aesthetic concern as much as an environmental one. In 1912, the first iteration of a national monitoring network was formed, a coalition of private and state bodies led by smoke abatement advocates. From the start, the approach taken was one of comparative analysis between monitoring locations. By measuring pollution levels in different towns and cities, an accurate picture could be built of how air quality varied across the country. As the network grew, places that were known to be less visibly polluted, like seaside towns and more rural areas, were also added, offering a sort of baseline of essentially clean air for comparison. This comparative approach required the network to be both distributed and centralized, and these two pressures drove the particular choice of monitoring devices and data analysis approaches. Collecting the data in a variety of different locations allows for a wealth of information to be gathered, and centralizing this data collection under one set of standards lets this information be compared in meaningful ways. To do this, pollution measurements taken in, say, London have to be essentially of the same kind as those taken in Leeds. This drove the choices about which types of monitoring device to install and use. Those that were too complicated to easily train people to operate tended to fall out of use, sometimes sacrificing richness of information in favour of the standardization that could maintain data integrity across a large number of sites. This was especially important as the network grew, and grow it did. At its founding in 1912, there were 30 government bodies, local authorities, and other parties contributing to the nascent monitoring scheme. By 1967, there were over 500. The 1956 Clean Air Act was certainly a spur to expanding monitoring throughout the country, but the network had been growing steadily before the Beaver Commission met in the early 50s. The growth of this network monitoring benefited greatly from increased government buy-in, both in terms of funding and the coordination that could be done by bodies like the Met Office. Today, air pollution monitoring remains both centralised and distributed, and the density of monitoring stations has continued to grow. In London alone, there are now 150 stations monitoring atmospheric pollutants. Techniques involving filtration of air through fabric to collect solid deposits are still in use, but the density of particulate matter can now also be measured by using lasers to determine how many particulates are present in a cubic metre of air. Other advances include measuring sulfur dioxide in the air by a type of spectroscopy, where the fluorescence produced upon contact with ultraviolet light is measured, and determining nitrogen dioxide levels by recording how much light is given off by these chemicals in the air. The basic approach remains the same as in earlier decades. You measure the actual amount of a solid pollutant, or induce some secondary effect in a soluble one, and then measure the outcomes of that. In some aspects, monitoring has also changed shape. Alongside the spot monitoring conducted at static sites, it is now also possible, with satellite monitoring and cheaper access to aerial imagery by drone, to accurately gauge the pollution levels in a certain area, by monitoring the size of smoke plumes over an industrial area, for example, or measuring the amount of light reflected back off airborne particulate matter over a city. Most importantly, monitoring has become much cheaper, and networks can now also take advantage of telecommunications advances to provide near real-time pollution information. Rather than air quality reports put together annually or quarterly, with the data reported in by monitoring stations to a central authority, much pollution data is now readily available online to anybody on websites like London Air for both study and personal interest. So air monitoring networks now not only provide comparative data to assess which areas in the country or a city are most polluted, but allow for detailed up-to-date information about the current state of air quality in specific neighbourhoods. We are now able to analyse pollution data down to the road level. This is important for determining precisely where clean air initiatives are needed, and has also inspired a wave of hyperlocal air activism. Clean air campaigns focused on specific places exist across London, like the Friends of Limehouse Environmental Group and Save Our Safer Streets and Tower Hamlets. Often these local groups are themselves also monitoring air quality locally, taking responsibility for the installation of air quality nodes that are constantly measuring ambient pollutants. They reflect a new change in monitoring approaches, where cheaper apparatuses with an increasing degree of connectivity allow for anyone to access air quality information for a very specific area. And this, in turn, has created conditions for air activism that is much more bottom-up than the smoke abatement movement we discussed in regards to smog. The early anti-smog campaigns were largely paternalistic, to an extent imposed from outside on highly polluted areas, and from above by wealthy or powerful social reformers whose concerns were as much with the maintenance of a healthy labour pool as with a basic right to protection from environmental hazard. Today, this dynamic has largely inverted, and clean air campaigning is more likely to come from the places currently most exposed to air pollutants. Local campaigns are informed and inspired by highly local air pollution data, and these smaller groups are often federated, but at a city rather than national level, through networks like Breathe London, a coalition of dozens of air monitoring and campaigning groups across the capital. This type of organisation encourages campaigning for specific local interventions to reduce car pollution, often in concert with academic research groups focusing on pollutants and their effects, like the Environmental Research Group at Imperial College London. And this approach has had a real degree of success. In London, air quality policy is now largely managed at the city level through the Mayor of London at City Hall, which also funds monitoring networks like Breathe London. It is through this office that initiatives like the Central London Congestion Charge were introduced in 2003, which saw a 15% total drop in traffic in the areas covered. This has been followed by a number of low-emission zones for trade and goods vehicles, and the Ultra-Low Emission Zone, or ULEZ, first introduced in 2019. Initially covering the same area as the congestion charge zone, the ULEZ was extended in 2021 to cover large areas of inner London, and again in 2023 to cover all of Greater London. Congestion charging seeks to curb traffic and associated emissions by discouraging car use within the given area by levelling costs against driving. Low emission zones, however, discourage driving more specifically, charging drivers of non-compliant vehicles to drive within the designated areas only. The ULEZ applies not just to trade vehicles, but to private cars too, and in higher polluting, generally older model cars are subject to fees for driving in these areas. Between 2023 and 2024, ULEZ areas saw a drop of 53% in non-compliant cars on the roads, constituting 90,000 fewer of these vehicles, and this drop has been associated with a significant decrease in emissions of hazardous pollutants like nitrogen dioxide. Emission levels in general are also falling nationally, apart from for levels of polyaromatic hydrocarbons, a small but highly carcinogenic component of air pollution, including from cars, whose levels appear to have stalled since 2010. This is no doubt due to successive waves of legislation, both national and local, that we've discussed. But in terms of car use, change may also be driven by other factors. In Air Part 1, we discussed how some part of the Clean Air Act's success may have been due to a pre-existing willingness in some areas to make changes in domestic heating. Non- or less polluting home heating systems, like gas-fired central heating, were already on the rise before 1956 and were gaining a reputation as upmarket and desirable. While the Clean Air Act massively accelerated the phasing out of open hearths and solid fuel-powered domestic appliances, some historians have argued that it is likely that some degree of change in this area would have happened either way. The role of government then became to provide the impetus, infrastructure and funding to allow people to make a change they were often already very willing to make. And in 21st century London, as the ULEZ is extended and other measures like low-traffic neighbourhoods are growing, we have already reached peak car. Car use in the city likely peaked in the mid-1990s, and the proportion of all trips in London taken by car has now fallen from its height at 50% down to 37%. This drop can be attributed only partially to the effects of policy driving down existing car usage, and is likely to be due instead to a cessation in growth of car use. The city's population has grown in this time, but the use of cars has not scaled with that growth. There are now more people in the city than ever before, but fewer of those people are driving compared to using public transport, walking or cycling. This growth pattern, now combined with the effects of extending car reduction policies further, is expected to drive the proportion of car trips down to 27% over the next 25 years. However, the number of delivery vans and taxis on London's roads is now growing, their number pushed up by internet-facilitated next-day delivery and gig work ride apps. Pollution from car emissions in London may also have peaked, reaching its highest proportion of total urban air pollution in the city in the very early 21st century. This is of course all good news, but I'm struck by how piecemeal the action on car pollution has been compared to the legislation on smoke. Despite its sometimes uneven effects, the Clean Air Act was sweeping. It required such significant change, and was facilitated in making that change by both policy and technological development, that solid fuel-fired home heating essentially ceased to exist in East London and many other highly polluted places. Not so with the car. Car pollution reduction is more incremental, done by degree, and often hyper-localised. We get the gradual creation and extension of low-emission zones, rather than a no-emission zone. Action on pollution is also often somehow personalised. Almost real-time pollution monitoring allows me to look up the air quality for today on my phone, reported alongside the weather. And based on this information, I am supposed to make good personal decisions about how to behave that day, whatever those decisions might be. Various private and state programs encourage and help subsidize the purchase of electric vehicles. And while this does constitute a type of state investment in a similar way to the original growth of car ownership, its effects are much more modest. As of 2021, there were only 69,000 electric cars in London out of roughly 2.5 million, both private and commercial. And all the while, investment in public transportation is consistently subject to cuts. It took me decades to install a car system in London, and there is no real political will to uproot it. Action on emissions is vital, and its successes are not to be discounted in the number of lives saved and life in neighbourhoods improved. But London as a car city remains in place. In this episode, we focus closely on cars as emitters of pollution, but there are of course other environmental and human effects of car systems that do not go away if every car becomes electric or every vehicle is ULEZ compliant. Homes, whether houses or blocks of flats, must have space for cars. Intricate automated systems of lights and signs govern the movement of these cars throughout the city, and also the movement of pedestrians who must be continually aware of these signals in order to walk safely. In practically every street in the city, it is truly dangerous to life to stand in the road without paying constant, close attention. There are still over 3,000 deaths or serious injuries from car accidents a year in London. Cities have always had streets and roads, so I think it's easy to assume that cities have always been, as it were, pre-car, places of essentially the same shape, rhythm, and organisation, just waiting for the car to plop down on their streets. But this isn't the case. Cars have changed cities hugely, in terms of how we use space and whose well-being is prioritised in those public spaces. Enrique Londoño has noted that the arrival of mass motoring altered urban life in such fundamental ways that it may even have shifted a real estate tendency likely as old as the human city itself. Only after city centres started to fill up with cars did the apartment block units closest to road level stop being the most desirable and most expensive. This had been the case even in ancient cities, which were hardly quiet places, and holds true even controlling for the invention of the lift some decades before mass car ownership. The cheap top-storey garret was replaced by the expensive penthouse only as people sought to literally rise above the fumes and clamour of the car-choked street. While researching air pollution from coal, I came across several references to the hearth of the fireplace as the heart of the British home. To the air pollution campaigner, this presented a problem for smoke abatement, and to the coal manufacturer was another good reason to claim reduction in coal use was simply impossible. I've been thinking a lot recently about car culture, and wondered whether the hearth and the car are analogous in this way. Both satisfy core material needs, heat and transportation respectively, but also have a cultural meaning that expands to include more than the satisfaction of those needs. Cars mean freedom and flexibility, and sometimes power and prestige. The car system reproduces itself not only materially, but culturally too. I wonder if the car as a technology is best understood as something extending beyond the sum of its parts, that the car is something more than just the internal combustion engine, its chassis, seats, and steering mechanism. Other vehicles have the same attributes, the ambulance, the delivery van, the bus, but they share only a small portion of their social effects with those of the car. It seems to be inherent to the technology of the car that it is a private means of transportation that must operate in public space, and in doing so, it changes our relationship to the city that we drive through. Some scholars of car history have indeed noted that as car advertising grew in the mid-20th century and sought to expand its market, the homeliness of cars started to be heavily emphasised. Your car could be just like home, with leather detailing, creature comforts, even radio. Car culture creates a situation where thousands of people are manoeuvring in a public space together while ensconced in a home-like environment that belongs just to them. It is a highly atomised mode of travel that introduces an unavoidable individualism into the tightly packed web of relations that are inherent to the city. Attempts to reduce car use, or even introduce friction into the car system, are then often met with local opposition. Alongside the clean air campaigns that have flourished across the city, residents will also organise to oppose low-traffic neighbourhoods, low-emission zones, and congestion charges. The extension of the congestion zone in Kensington and Chelsea, for example, was fiercely fought against at a local level for many years. More recently, the extension of the ULEZ has also met with significant opposition, including at local authority level, especially in outer London boroughs with Conservative-led councils. In 2023, Bexley, Bromley, Harrow and Hillingdon councils, as well as Surrey County Council, eventually went so far as to bring a judicial review against both TfL and the Mayor's office, arguing that the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, had overstepped the powers of his office in extending the ULEZ and provided inadequate consultation and provision for scrappage despite a £110 million scheme for the latter. Analysis of monitoring data in 2025 found that several boroughs whose councils had most vehemently opposed the ULEZ extension were also those who had seen the largest drop in harmful emissions, including Croydon, Merton, Harrow and Bromley, all of which saw nitrogen oxide levels fall by about 15% compared to projections. Everybody wants to breathe clean air, so I think we're best able to understand these different strands of opposition if we consider them as different expressions of the car system replicating itself. The boroughs that have seen the largest air quality benefit from ULEZ expansion are those where people are often the most car-reliant. It is no coincidence that this car reliance is often found in the outer boroughs that do not benefit from the same density of public transport as places near the centre of London. Only 30% of trips in the outer boroughs are made by public transport, compared to over 50% within the area that was originally covered by ULEZ before the extension. Buying a new ULEZ-compliant car is therefore likely to affect a larger number of people, where 69% of households have access to at least one car. However, while some of the organised opposition to ULEZ was clear on the desire for more extensive scrappage schemes and financial support for vehicle renewal, much rather seems attached to the intangible life of the car as a vector of identity and certain values. The car has become a powerful ideological site of freedom and flexibility, and this can dovetail with existing political tendencies. The councils who brought the judicial review against the Labour mayor were all Tory-led, and council leaders in boroughs like Bromley spoke not so much of the effect on their constituencies as on motorists. To drive a car is not just something you do, but has become something that you are. If public transport and environmental policy become sites of left-leaning politics, then the car can become synecdochic with conservative, right-leaning political values, and the right to drive becomes a broader assertion about which individual and collective rights should or should not be prioritised more widely. This melding of right-wing politics with pro-car activism can be seen very clearly at the most radical end of ULEZ opposition. There have been a number of anti-ULEZ protests in which traffic monitoring cameras have been vandalised and even destroyed. These protests have become explicitly political and sometimes conspiratorial, linking the expansion of ULEZ to anti-car political action as a whole and opposing that based on both an ideological commitment to the specific form of personal freedom offered by the car and also conspiratorially to the imagined imposition of authoritarian 15-minute cities in which residents are forbidden to leave their neighbourhoods. Going deep on this phenomenon is beyond our scope here, but if you're interested in the particular ways the conspiracy-driven far-right has responded to ULEZ extensions, I'd highly recommend listening to an episode of the QAA podcast by Annie Kelly on this, that I will link in the show notes. Suffice to say that the car has a political life of its own, that is expressed not only in more fringe ways like the 15-minute cities protests, but also within party politics and even the courts. To take action on air pollution in cities is now to take on the whole car system, as it exists in material terms in fulfilling transportation needs, and how it exists in human terms, in the values and emotional investments that we all attach to driving. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Worm from Home. While writing this episode, I corresponded with Professor Frank Kelly, air pollution researcher and director of the Environmental Research Group at Imperial College London. I'd like to thank him very much for his contributions, without which this episode would certainly have been much less informed on the most recent picture of air pollution in London. If you've enjoyed the show and want to support production, you can do so with words, by leaving a rating and review on your podcast app, sharing the episode, or telling your family and friends. Or, if you'd like, you can support the show with money by becoming a paid member at patreon.com/wormfromhome. In either case, your support will be really appreciated. I make this show because I love radio and I love nature, but also to create opportunities to learn for myself and others. If you have any questions, feedback, or knowledge you'd like to share, or analyses of your own on the topics we cover, please do get in touch. On the Patreon, at Worm From Home on Twitter, or Worm From Home Pod on Instagram. Until next time.